Dr. Jenny Stewart is an honorary professor of public policy in the University of New South Wales at the Australian Defence Force Academy. Dr. Jenny has served Australian Public Service as policy advisor before starting academic career in Cambridge University and at FAR as well. Her area of expertise include law, politics, and public administration. Dr. Jenny has interest in research, teaching, and writing in the field of public analysis, change management, and public sector reforms. Her notable writings include The Lie of the Level Playing Field, Renegotiating the Environment, the Power of Politics, Public Policies, Values, and the Dilemma of Engagement, the Role of Representation in Government. A very high-profile personality in the area of public policy. Dr. Jenny, please.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to speak here today. We came all the way from Woden Valley up to Dixon. It's interesting, isn't it, how one tends to focus on one side or the other of Canada. We're kind of south of the lake, but we're very pleased to be north of the lake today. Today's forum, Australia, under new management, the new Abbott government. Are we better off or are we worse off? Well, I want to talk a little bit about manufacturing industry. As was mentioned, one of my first published books, The Level Playing Field, was about manufacturing. And I felt then, the book was published about 20 years ago, that our policies were deficient in relation to manufacturing. Just how deficient is becoming more and more obvious. So I guess if we're thinking about who's better off and who's worse off, it does depend on who you are, where you live, and what you do. And if you're a worker in the manufacturing sector, and particularly in the motor vehicle industry, I think you would feel that the incoming government has been a very bad deal indeed. Just to remind people, in motor vehicle manufacturing, in rapid succession, some before the change of government, more after, we've lost Ford, Mitsubishi, most recently General Motors, Holland, and now Toyota. But here's the big question, isn't it? Who cares? Do Australians actually care about what used to be called, I guess, iconic brands of motor vehicles? Most of us drive imported cars. More and more of us drive hulking big sports utility vehicles. So perhaps there's not a lot of emotional attachment to Australian-produced motor vehicles on the part of Australian consumers. But this government, the Abbott government, went one step further, I think, and really administered the coup de grace to Holden and to Toyota. The previous government had a transition fund, or a transformation fund, to use the currently more fashionable term, for the two firms that were left, and the Productivity Commission was reporting on those. But the government jumped in and said there's going to be a lot less money for supporting manufacturing. So although Tony Abbott and Joe Hockey said, well, it was really circumstances beyond our control, that was not strictly true. But I just want to go a bit further than that, and to think about, well, the place of manufacturing in the Australian economy and how important it might be. Most of us are lucky enough to have jobs, work in the services sector. About 80% and that's been increasing steadily over the years. How many of us sort of check the stuff we buy to see where it was made? I know I like to, but if you do check to see if stuff's made in Australia, the choices are becoming more and more limited. So perhaps you could say, well, hey, the car industry was never really going to survive. It had to be supported by too much public money. But let's consider some other industries. The food processing sector. There was another high-profile case, SPCR Mona, which got nothing at all from the federal government, but succeeded in attracting some support from the Victorian government. So who does get support from the government? I mean, where are the jobs actually going to come from, apart from services? Well, if you're a farmer, you're doing okay. The government just announced, I think, a $300 million program for farmers in the circumstances of drought. And if you're a miner, you're not too badly off, I guess. You're not going to be paying that tax that so bedevilled the Gillard government. So if you're a farmer, this government considers drought to be a force of nature, which you can't do anything about. But if you're manufacturing and the dollar rises up, that's not a force of nature, although it's obviously something that you can't do very much about. So if we think about the car industry and other manufacturers, it's a little surprise that many of them are giving up with a high dollar and declining tariffs. So if you have no policy, and I've argued that we haven't had an industry policy in this country, you get industry politics. And the current government is a very good government at playing the politics. So we've got a lot of union bashing. In fact, I sometimes think Tony Abbott still thinks he's in opposition. You get that feeling that he's still in there as the attack dog, and perhaps he hasn't quite figured out that he's the guy that's supposed to be in charge. Talking about industry politics, it'll be interesting to see what the government does about the ethanol industry, which is supported by a rebate on the excise that would otherwise be payable on petroleum that has had ethanol added to it. But the producers there are based in rural Australia, and one of the biggest companies, Manildra, is an important part of New South Wales politically. So watch that one. Will we get policy, as in Tough Tony and Tough Joe, or will we get politics and that particular subsidy? My guess is we'll probably continue. Just want to say a little bit about defence industry. This is something that I have looked at quite a bit over the years, and I spent the last 4 or 5 years of my academic career at the Defence Force Academy. So, do we need a defence industry, as in a manufacturing industry that's dedicated to defence purposes? Well, the Navy says we do, and there is an Australian-based shipbuilding industry. But without an overarching policy for manufacturing, it's really difficult to see how the remnant shipbuilding industry and the firms associated with that are actually going to be able to carry out some of the more complex tasks, such as building the air warfare destroyer that the current government will inherit or has inherited from the previous ones. But we do need a profitable and competitive traded goods sector overall. Mining's not going to keep paying the bills for this country indefinitely, and if you look at investment patterns, they're falling, as they are indeed and have been falling in manufacturing. So what's Tony going to do about that? Because I guess most of us are pretty concerned about jobs, if not for ourselves, then for our kids, our neighbours, our communities, and so on. I don't think Tony Abbott is actually going to have the same luck that his famous predecessor, John Howard, did. Because there's not a lot of policy levers he can actually use to try and support competitive employment. There's no going back on tariffs, that is taxes on imports. That's been a settled policy for some time. They've been talking, the current government, a bit about doing trade deals, but as we don't actually have very much to negotiate with in trade deals, I don't think much will be happening on that front. So that just leaves one thing for Tony to do, and that is to focus on the wages and conditions of Australian workers. Now that's a pretty tricky one, isn't it? Because work choices is dead, we've been told. It's been triply, quadruply interred. And this is a government that knows how to, I think, manage the policy agenda. In the case of asylum seekers, they don't even tell themselves what's going on. And we saw Joe Hockey, who's even tougher than Tony when it comes to supporting industry, strutting his stuff at the recent G20 forum. But in just winding up, I want to come back to my original question. Does this government actually really care about the kinds of industries that certainly I believe, and I guess many of you do too, the sorts of industries that Australia will need in the future? I'm not so sure that they do, because just thinking about it, this is a very Sydney-based government, isn't it? Tony Abbott's from Sydney, Joe Hockey, most certainly from Sydney. And I think the perspective of the Emerald City colours their outlook. So Sydney-siders, I don't know, they're into maybe banking or international money dealings, all that sort of thing. But towns like Canberra, public administration, towns like Geelong, towns like Adelaide do other kinds of things, and I'm not sure that this government has any kind of a feel for those sorts of activities. So it remains to be seen what they will come up with. Will Tony retain his attack dog persona and keep socking it to the unions? I think there's only a limited extent to which he can really do that, but he has been promising the employers that he will be pushing in the direction of simplifying boards and reducing wages and conditions. Australia's a kind of high-wage island, aren't we? In a sea of countries where wages are much lower. And that is a huge strategic, intellectual and perhaps moral challenge for all of us. I'm not sure that the Abbott government is really up to meeting it. So thank you for your attention. I'll welcome questions later on.